Well, hello everyone. Rita McGrath here, and I am absolutely thrilled to host a very special Thought Spark with H.R. McMaster. So, H.R. McMaster served from 2017 to 2018 as the National Security Advisor to then President Donald Trump. He graduated from West Point, earned a doctorate from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and during the Gulf War in 1991, he was a captain commanding Eagle Troop of the 20 Armored Cavalry. And forgive me for reading this, I want to make sure I get it right. At the Battle of 73 Easting, though significantly outnumbered and encountering the enemy by surprise, the 9 tanks of his troop destroyed 28 Iraqi tanks without loss in 23 minutes. And he was awarded the Silver Star. He is the author of this fabulous book, At War with Ourselves, my tour of duty in the Trump White House, and I think we're going to have to retitle it In the First Trump White House. So HR, welcome. I'm so pleased to have the chance to chat with you.
Hey, thanks, Rita. I'm a big fan. It's wonderful to be with you.
Oh, how delightful. So before we jump into what we have coming for us in the second Trump administration, maybe start with the beginning of why you joined the first Trump administration. You know, you were a commander, you had all this power, you had all these people that you could possibly, with your very senior position in the Army, never served in Washington in a staff position. What made you decide to do that?
Well, Rita, President Trump was the 7th commander-in-chief under whom I'd served since I took the oath of service on what's called the plane at the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1980. And, I felt a sense of duty, and I was considered a privilege, to serve a newly elected president who had clearly gone to Washington to disrupt a lot of things. And, I believed in 2017 there were a lot of policies and strategies that needed to be disrupted because, I'd been on the receiving end of policies and strategies developed in Washington that made little sense to me in places like Baghdad, Iraq, or Kabul, Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And so I thought it would be a privilege to continue serving the job that I had at the time in February of 2017 when I got the call to interview for the job at Mar-a-Lago, was to design the future Army. And I was very concerned that we had lost a lot of our competitive advantages based on a high degree of complacency based on over-optimism in the 1990s. And I think some unwise strategies and policies associated with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I thought at the time we had kind of a crisis of confidence in America's ability to advance our interests through a sensible, reasoned approach to foreign policy and national security.
So the call to, I think there's a Epictetus was the most important role assigned to you, and you said that was your job, right? To carry out that, right? And a lot of people would have been horrified, right? They just thought, oh, why would you sign up for this? What you knew was going to be a pretty grueling battle.
Well, I had studied the role of national security advisor, and I had been a student of national security decision making and policy making. I had written a book that was based on my doctoral dissertation called Dereliction of Duty, Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Lies that Led to Vietnam. And in that book, I criticized the National Security Advisor, George Bundy, for running an ineffective policymaking process that was essentially designed to give Lyndon Johnson what he wanted, to tell him what he wanted to hear, really based on Johnson's preoccupation with his domestic political agenda, getting elected in his own right in 1964, and passing the Great Society legislation in 1965. So I had this great gift that the Army gave me, which was to study, read, write about history, and teach history at the United States Military Academy. And I had a whole range of practical experience in multinational and interagency, as we call it, task forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. And while nobody is really prepared for a job of that kind of scope and responsibility, fully prepared, I felt like my career had prepared me well to help a newly elected president formulate his approach to foreign policy and to national security.
Mm-hmm. And that was a particularly pivotal time, 2017, 2018. So a lot of our listeners will not really understand the nuances of the national security apparatus. So maybe give us a little bit of background on that entity and that role, because it's not a cabinet role, right? As you said in the book, you have one client, which is the president. You don't have all these different constituencies that you're working for, and a lot of people don't understand the nuance of that. So maybe if you could give us
Sure.
some color on that.
So, Rita, the origins of the National Security Council were in the document NSC 68, a document that was meant to organize kind of the national security apparatus after World War II. And what informed that effort in large measure was the failure of intelligence, the surprise of Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. And the lesson was that the departments and agencies of the government weren't talking effectively with one another, weren't coordinating efforts together. And then, of course, during the war, it was immensely important to integrate, for example, military strategy with economic policy, and especially a burgeoning defense industrial base to generate the material needed to wage the war against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. And so it was really, the lessons of Pearl Harbor and World War II that generated the National Security Council, what evolved into the National Security Council. It began with a very small staff, and then under the pressure of the Korean War, President Truman, who was very skeptical initially about this National Security Council staff, like, why do I need that? Then he realized, well, I really do need it. And he began to convene weekly National Security Council meetings. But really, the role of the National Security Council staff is to coordinate and integrate efforts across the departments and agencies to get the president best advice, best analysis. And also, I believe that it's critical to present the president with multiple options, so that the president can make his or her own decisions, based on the direction that the elected president wants to take. And the National Security Advisor, as you mentioned, not a cabinet official, doesn't have responsibility for a department and agency, and is the only person in the foreign policy and national security establishment who has the president as his or her only client. And I believe you have to do perform five critical tasks well as a national security advisor. The first of these is to staff the president, right? Make sure the president is prepared for any engagement involving foreign policy or national security. The second thing you have to do is, as already mentioned, run the process. Run the process that coordinates and integrates those efforts across the departments and agencies. The third is you have to communicate. You have to communicate the president's decisions and policies to those who have to implement them in the U.S. government, but also to other relevant audiences. Sometimes audiences abroad, sometimes the American people, especially if you have cabinet secretaries who are camera shy and don't want to do that themselves, And then the fourth thing that you, I think, have to do is you have to foster unity of effort with like-minded partners and allies abroad. And we have kind of this club of national security advisors who from like-minded countries, strategic partners and allies, who would help coordinate the efforts of our heads of state so we can reinforce one another and work together toward mutually agreed goals and outcomes. And then finally, this is important as well, is you have to lead an organization of very dedicated sometimes young people, sometimes older people on the National Security Council staff, and provide them with what we call in the Army, purpose, motivation, and direction, and hopefully create, an environment and a culture within that National Security Council staff that's based in understanding their role, right? It's not their role to implement policy. It's not their role to advance their good ideas, right? It's their role, again, to coordinate and integrate these efforts across the departments and agencies and provide the president with options.
Well, and I love the way that you frame the options, right? Option one, option two, option three, often on one or two pages. So it becomes very digestible. And I think, I work a lot in business, obviously, and I think that role is often really missing, which is, okay, here we are, here's the terrain as best we see it. But what actually are our choices? And what I find in both in business and perhaps you've seen it in government, is people jump on the first sort of vaguely plausible thing. And they don't really think about, well, what actually are the range of options, and what are the pros and cons, and what are the consequences for making each of these different choices. And I think you laid that out very beautifully in the book, and I thought that was really powerful. the way that you framed that.
Well, oh, thanks, Rita. I had learned, a lot from studying history and the history of really what I saw as kind of failed strategy and policy development during Vietnam. And you're right, people tend to rush right to action, right? And to not spend enough time thinking about the nature of the challenges that we're facing. And, it was quite a surreal feeling to walk in to the West Wing of the White House and go to my office, the Office of the National Security Advisor, and realize, okay, hey, now I was responsible for the policymaking, decision-making process that I had criticized from the perspective of a historian. And so I took out a legal pad and I wrote down what I thought were the 5 critical lessons from the book Dereliction of Duty and the research that I had conducted around Vietnam, but also my knowledge of kind of previous administrations. And the first of these was, as you're alluding to, is so important. Try, apply design thinking, right, and problem framing to the most significant challenges we're facing. Take more time to think about the nature of the challenge instead of rushing to action, because oftentimes, Rita, we confuse activity with progress, and the second key lesson, was to have clearly defined goals and objectives. During the period in which Vietnam became an American war, the National Security Advisor, McGeorge Bundy, he actually argued, hey, it's better not to have a goal in Vietnam, because he said, quote, that will give President Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, more flexibility in the domestic political arena if you don't accomplish that goal. The third key lesson.
I did not know that. What?
Oh yeah, he said
have a goal?
It's better not to, because of course there were senior military and civilian advisors saying, hey, what's our objective in Vietnam? Shouldn't we be clear about that? And the National Security Advisor says, no, it's better not to have a clearly defined, publicly announced objective.
So you're sending at the time we had the draft, right? So you're sending young men off to die in this war, and you don't know what it's for.
Well, absolutely. And, I write a lot about in At War with Ourselves, I felt that we had that kind of situation in Afghanistan as well, where our goals had become very ambiguous. And I think, Rita, what I've learned in the Army, as you're leading soldiers into combat, is the true test of strategy is if you can explain to soldiers in a platoon how the risk that they will take on an operation, how the sacrifices they may be called on to make would contribute to an outcome worthy of those risks and worthy of those sacrifices. I think that's your duty as a senior leader, to provide that kind of clarity to your soldiers. And I felt as if obviously that was missing in Vietnam, and certainly by the time in 2017, it was missing in Afghanistan as well. So I thought it not only important in connection with our vital interests in Afghanistan, but I felt it as an ethical duty, a moral duty, to help President Trump clarify what we're trying to achieve in Afghanistan, and to give him options to put in, I think, what was at that time the most, the first really sustainable, reasoned approach to the war there. Of course, he abandoned that later when he sent Ambassador Zhao Khalilzad, essentially, I think, to surrender to the Taliban with this agreement in February of 2020. I write about that in the book in terms of disappointment that President Trump, having made, I think, a fantastic decision, a hard decision to make on Afghanistan in August of 2017. You might recall he gave a great speech about that and said, hey, this isn't what I was going to do when I came into the White House, but when you sit behind the desk in the Oval Office, you have a different perspective. And he talked about why he reversed his predisposition toward Afghanistan. But sadly, he didn't stick with that tough decision. And we had
you talked about that as a pattern throughout, that he would make these tough decisions, and then the last person to talk to him would influence a change of direction. But let's go back to your legal pad. So you were on, I think, point 2.
Oh, sure. So hey, take more time thinking about the nature of the problem. The second is have clear goals and objectives. Of course, anybody in business knows that, right? I mean, that's, it's like the Geico commercial. I mean, everybody knows that. So then, and then the third key lesson was to really identify clearly the assumptions on which the policymaking would be based, right, and the strategy would be based. Oftentimes, when I was on the receiving end of these policies and strategies developed in Washington that made no sense in Iraq and Afghanistan, they were based on implicit, fundamentally flawed assumptions. And because those assumptions were implicit, they never really got challenged. So I think it's important to make those options, those assumptions explicit. The third or the fourth lesson is to always provide multiple options, right? And in the run up to the Vietnam War, to the Americanization of the Vietnam War, President Johnson was making decisions on Vietnam based primarily on his domestic political agenda. And what he wanted a strategy that would allow him to avoid alienating key constituencies on which his political agenda depended.
Mm.
And so that's what his advisors gave him. They gave him what he wanted. And it was that shiny option of graduated pressure, by the way, that nobody had really any faith in. We went to war with a strategy that the majority of Lyndon Johnson's advisors thought would fail. And so I decided, okay, we must insist on giving the president multiple options, because it's in the comparison of those courses of action that you can really draw out the advantages and disadvantages and the long-term costs and consequences of each of those options. And then finally, I would endeavor to insulate the development of those options from partisan political considerations. And of course, people will have their say, with the president in connection with how this will play with, for example, Donald Trump's political base and so forth. But I didn't want a preoccupation with partisan politics to infect the development of those options for the president.
So I thought that was incredibly powerful. So for those of you that are just joining us, I am here with H.R. McMaster. We're talking about a lot of things, but among them his brand new book, just came out in August, called At War with Ourselves, My Tour of Duty in the Trump White House. And I guess we'll have to retitle it The First Trump White House and think about that. So let's go back to Lyndon Johnson for a minute, because I find him fascinating as a political character, because he spent how many decades assembling power, and among the ways he assembled power was he really aligned himself with the Southerners, right? And if you looked at the first sort of half of his career, let's call it, he was all about preserving white supremacy and not allowing a lot of the things that later became part of the civil rights plank to become real. And then when he got power, he did this very unusual thing. He reversed course. He actually said, no, this is my agenda. And now that I've got power, I want to make this agenda a reality. And I wonder if you have reflections on that. Does that resonate with some of the maybe the later dysfunctions of his national security apparatus? Because he was so obsessed with domestic policy.
Right. He was. And he did take really very important actions, especially, the Civil Rights Act, and of course, as you mentioned, he was a Dixie Democrat, a party that had been tied to Jim Crow and the disenfranchisement of Black Americans in the South. So it really took Lyndon Johnson to do it. The civil rights agenda was stalled under John F. Kennedy, and it took a senator from Texas who had those relationships. And it's not a true conversation. But if anybody's seen the movie or the play All the Way with LBJ, that conversation that in the play, it's fictitious, but it captures the spirit of the time. When he calls his old mentor, the senator from Georgia, Richard Russell, right, and tries to convince Richard Russell to vote for the Civil Rights Act. It's a very powerful scene in the play and in the movie that I highly recommend. But really, it took LBJ to do it. And he did it, we should mention, in alliance with a lot of Republicans, Southern Republicans in particular, who, and so you can see how Johnson was willing to work across the aisle, right? And how that delivered a great outcome, at least in terms of the end of de jure segregation and de jure inequality of opportunity. Now, of course, de facto desegregation and inequality of opportunity remained, and even today we still have a lot of work to do on certain issues, like the fact that the zip code into which one is born determines the number of obstacles that somebody has to overcome before they can take advantage of the great promise of this country, right? So we haven't reached utopia yet, but I think it's important to acknowledge those great achievements of the civil rights movement and what LBJ was able to do, maybe uniquely positioned to do. Because, as you mentioned, he came from the group of people, the Southern Democrats, who were the greatest obstacle
Mhm.
to the civil rights movement.
Well, the story I heard was that the Civil Rights Act had been voted down and voted down and voted down, and everybody in Washington thought he was beat, like it wasn't going to happen. And so he went off to his ranch and cogitated on this. And the story I was told, and I wonder if you have any reflections on this, was so he knew the South wasn't going to go with him. He knew the North was. But then you had these Rocky Mountain folks that they had been trying for years to get this really terrible idea passed in Congress, which was to put dams over the Snake River and other places to get them cheap electricity to the Rocky Mountain states for their constituencies. And it's an environmental disaster. It's a really terrible idea. But apparently what I'm told is he went to them and he said, hey, if you vote with me on civil rights, I can get you your dams. And they believed him and voted with him, and that's how we eventually got this,
Well,
monumental legislation.
Yeah, I mean, so what you see is, right, you see one of the strengths of LBJ, right, which is this ability to get things done, through compromise or, in this case, kind of horse trading, but also, that was one of his character flaws when you thrust him into the executive office of the president, because that same kind of behavior, that same kind of, trying to make everybody happy, right, by everybody getting something, was a disaster when applied to Vietnam. And I tell the story in Dereliction of Duty about a meeting that he has with his closest advisors. One of the things about LBJ, and I have a chapter actually in At War with Ourselves called LBJ and DJT, where I kind of compare and contrast the personalities and of those two presidents, the former and future president Donald Trump and Lyndon Johnson. And one of the strengths of both of them is like they kind of thought of themselves as great deal makers and so forth, and they also but both of them were very good at like trying to get like something done, what LBJ did in this period of time is he was trying to make all of his constituents happy to again pursue this domestic agenda. And so he has a lunch meeting. He had Tuesday lunches with his closest advisors, right? The people he trusted the most, because he was very distrustful in many ways, like Donald Trump is too, and so he had a very closed advisory circle, and they were talking about a speech he was about to give at Johns Hopkins University, where you have historians have characterized as Johnson's great vision for peace for Vietnam and everything. Well, I was the first researcher to get access to the notes from those Tuesday meetings. And in this meeting, Johnson had said the speech was aimed at, quote, the Sob Sisters and peace societies, because what he wanted to do was placate the left or those opposed to the war in Vietnam. Then at the same time, he calls the Joint Chiefs of Staff in. And he has this meeting in which he says, I'm like a coach I used to know, and you're my team. And it's halftime, and we're down 21-0. And I need your recommendations on what we can do to win this war. So what he's doing is he's trying to be all things to all people. And that middle path that he takes, and you mentioned kind of the way he kind of affected this compromise with the Snake River for the Civil Rights Act, that becomes a significant deficiency in his character and personality when applied to war, because war involves killing and the prospect of death, right? The stakes are quite high. And that lack of clarity and strategy, going to war without a clear vision, I think was obviously in retrospect a disaster.
So interesting. So let's come back to your tour of duty here. So you arrive in the role, and you're replacing Michael Flynn, who had been there 22 days. By the way, one of the fascinating things to me about your book is you've got all these characters who like fly into the world for a brief period of time and then fly out again, and you refer to your tenure as Scaramucci's, which I thought was just fascinating. You lasted, I recall, 41.3 Scaramucci's.
That's exactly right. So Scaramucci became a unit of measurement for your tenure in the Trump administration, because Scaramucci, of course, many of your audience knows. I mean, he's a real character, that guy, and became a friend. But he got fired after 11 days. So we jokingly made that a unit of measurement, for tenure in the Trump administration.
Well, and the administration was characterized, and I imagine will be characterized by pretty short tenures. People would come in and hang out for a while, and then something would go wrong, and they'd get fired, or they'd voluntarily leave. And I kind of think that's problematic. I mean, if you're dealing with huge policy issues, and the other thing I was very impressed by in the book is I was looking at some of the schedules you talk about in terms of just like the days on the road and what you were doing and who you were meeting with, and it was exhausting just reading it. I can't imagine living it. So how do you create a consistent long-term policy when you've got people coming and going like a revolving door?
Yeah, well, it's difficult, obviously, and I think what happens in the Trump administration the first time around is that there was probably nobody more surprised than Donald Trump that he had won the election. So you might remember, like, he was kind of surprised himself. He didn't even have a speech prepared, supposedly. The team came together very quickly. President Trump didn't know a lot of the people who he brought in. He met them for the first time. I'm thinking about the secretaries of state and defense and the DNI and CIA. I don't think he knew Mike Pompeo. I mean, so he's bringing a whole team that people had recommended to him, but he didn't really have kind of the trust, knowledge of those people. And what that did is it created opportunities. It created that lack of sort of trust and long-term relationships, created opportunities for those who wanted to separate the president from some of his closest advisors, and to erode trust or to create divisions or gaps in relationships. And these are people who I think kind of come into any administration, right? I think you have three types of people in any administration, Rita. You have people who are there because they understand that their role is to serve the elected president, and it's their job to provide these multiple options, to provide best analysis, and to help the president determine his or her own agenda. Then there's a second group of people who come into any administration, I think, and they come in because they want to advance their agenda, right? They've got their idea on trade or whatever it is, and they're going to advance that agenda. And there's a third group of people, and I think this was maybe a larger number in the first Trump administration, I think certainly than in the second, who kind of defined their role as saving the country and the world from the president. They thought the president was kind of an emergency to be contained. And the problem with that second and third group is, like, not only do they not serve the president well, but also they kind of undermine the Constitution, because if you believe that sovereignty lies with the people and the people elected the president, nobody elects these people, right? So I think that created a lot of tension. That was part of the at war with ourselves part of the Trump administration. I think what's different this time, Rita, is that the president knows, I think, all the people he's appointing for better or worse, right? I mean, and so there'll be, I think, initially a higher degree of trust between him and those whom he appoints, and those who, I mean, if they make it through Senate confirmation.
That's really interesting. Well, and of course, the headlines have been rolling about all the different appointees, and are they really qualified, and do we really want Dr. Oz running Health and Human Services and that kind of thing?
Right.
But I think you make a really important point, which is, if the chief decision maker, who, and you say throughout the book, you have such deep respect for the Constitution and for the fact that this was the person the people elected, and therefore, if we're in service to that idea of the Constitution, regardless of our own personal feelings, it's our job to really serve that person. I think that's
and to have confidence in the institutions, Rita. I mean, I know there are a lot of people who, I mean, there are a lot of words that were thrown around, right, about Donald Trump, and of course, he's an offensive person to many people, right? He's a polarizing figure to many people. But I think what happens is, of course, he says and does things oftentimes that are offensive, that alienates large numbers of Americans, that kind of reduces confidence in our democratic institutions and so forth. But oftentimes the reaction to him is just as bad or worse, than what Donald Trump does. And so I think we all need to bolster our confidence in our institutions, right? Demand that our institutions do their job. If you're interested and care about checks on presidential power, heck, Article 1 of the Constitution is where you go for that with the Congress, or Article 3 with the judiciary. And where President Trump has overstepped, in terms of his Article 2 authority as president, whether it's election denial, well, the court struck all that down. And what you see with the advice and consent role of the Senate that John Adams wrote about eloquently in Federalist 76, you're seeing the Senate exercise that now, right? I don't think under Senator Thune, that the Senate is just going to do whatever the heck Donald Trump tells them to do, and that's good, right? That's what our founders had in mind, because our founders put those checks in place because they had Oliver Cromwell on their minds, right? They wanted to make sure that the executive did not act in a way that was against the will of the people, and the will of the people is represented by their representatives in Congress. So anyway, I think that we have to be on the side of strengthening our institutions, not undermining our institutions. And I think some of these nominees, I think didn't make it, because I think the Senate made clear that they thought that person would not strengthen the institution, but could be damaging to that institution.
So to come back to that, just something that certainly on the left side of the spectrum never gets talked about is this huge issue around the Russian disinformation, the Russian involvement in the 2016 election, the FBI and the CIA's role in that. And you're quite critical of that and the subsequent shadow it really cast over certainly the period that you were in the administration, of Trump's willingness to defend the institutions because he felt they were actually rigged against him. And maybe you could elaborate on that a little, because I don't think that story gets told a lot. And I don't think a lot of people on the leftward side of the spectrum actually want to hear that.
No, they don't want to hear it probably, but it's important to hear it, right? So I think that when President Trump says that the Department of Justice was weaponized against him, hey, he's got a case, right? Remember, it was the Mueller investigation was it really, if you go back to where it initiated from the discredited Steele dossier, which was funded in part, by the Clinton campaign in 2016. And then remember, the FBI agents who were conducting that investigation were communicating, saying, hey, we're going to stop this guy. We're going to stop Trump. They went into Mike Flynn's office, my predecessor, and I'll tell you, they kind of set him up. They went in there. He had no legal counsel there. There was no White House counsel or National Security Council lawyers there. And they said, we just want to talk to you, and all of this comes out, Rita, in the Durham report, right? So, don't take my word for it. Go to the DOJ report about this misuse of power by the DOJ. So that there's a real issue there. Now, does Trump take that to an extreme? Yeah, of course he does, right? I think the person who will go down in history as being, extremely effective and principled is William Barr, who was President Trump's second attorney general. Now, he's himself a controversial figure, as is anybody who kind of served in the Trump administration. But that guy is a true professional, understood his role. He knew he wasn't the president's personal lawyer, right? And when the president began to expect that he act that way, he resigned, and so, but in that period of time, I think he did a lot to restore confidence in the Justice Department. That's the kind of reformer you need as the Attorney General. You don't want somebody to come in who, in the effort to reverse what they perceive as the weaponization of the Attorney General's office and the Department of Justice, against Trump and so forth, to take corrective action that further diminishes our confidence in that institution. So I think this is the case across many institutions, Department of Defense as well. The Biden administration, in my view, was pushing a social and a political agenda on the military. I don't think they succeeded in doing that. The Trump administration has identified a desire to reverse that politicization of the Pentagon. I think in the appointed civilian officials in particular. But I hope that what they do from a corrective perspective doesn't actually diminish further our confidence in our military as being separate from any of this partisan political, vitriol nonsense that we're engaged in. Because Our military can't afford that. Our military is the military of all American people. We need our best young men and women to join our armed forces at this critical time in our history, regardless of what their political predilections are. We don't give a damn in the military. What we care about is, do you have the character, the physical strength, the endurance, the courage, the sense of honor, the willingness to sacrifice to be an effective warrior for America. That's what we should care about, not anybody's like identity category or political affiliation. And so I think that the Trump administration, as it comes in, is going to be faced with this choice, right? Do you get mired further in these sort of, and be, contribute to these centripetal forces that are pulling us apart from each other on the far left and far right? Or do you just try to transcend it, right? Put a brake on those centripetal forces, and get to the politics of addition. Bring, the vast majority of Americans together around an agenda that we can all agree, that we can agree on, or at least the vast majority of Americans can agree on.
Mm-hmm. So you've talked about one of the positives of being part of the Trump administration was the ability to address what you saw as some of the flawed directions that previous administrations had taken with some of our allies and some of the the sort of institutional norms of international trade. So I'll take China as an example. And I remember when China ascended to the WTO, it was like kumbaya and, bubbles and flowers, and everybody was saying, oh, this is fantastic. China is going to become part of the West, and they're going to, ascribe to more Western norms, and this is all going to be awesome. And from where I sit, it sort of looks like they played their hand beautifully, and we just got taken for a ride. So talk a little bit about what your view was of how you could shift those dynamics.
Well, this was a top priority in the Trump administration, and really, I quickly became a student of U.S. relations with China and the economic relationship and the degree to which China had weaponized its statist mercantilist economic model against us. Mm-hmm. And I was quite fortunate to have on the staff a senior director for Asia named Matt Pottinger, who I'm sure of your audience knows, an extraordinarily talented, experienced person who had been a Wall Street Journal reporter in China. Was very knowledgeable about the nature of the competition. And so what we endeavored to do is to help President Trump put into place what we believed was a long overdue corrective to the U.S. approach to China, an approach that was based on, as you alluded to, Rita, the fundamentally flawed and by 2017 discredited assumption that China, having been welcomed into the international economic order, would play by the rules. And then as China prospered, it would liberalize its economy and liberalize its form of governance even. And so it was clear by 2017 that was not the case, right? That China, rather than supporting the international order and rules of international discourse economically and financially and so forth, and militarily from a security perspective, was really determined to tear down those rules and place them and replace them with a new set of rules that was sympathetic to and beneficial to their economic model and to their authoritarian form of governance. And so, kind of, hashtag predictable for a historian, I asked our staff to get me the policy documents from the post-Cold War U.S. administrations relevant to China and China policy. And we put together what we called a principal small group framing session. I mentioned at the outset, that we were determined to take more time thinking about the nature of problems. And with each of these significant challenges to national security, we convened a framing session around a 5-page paper, Rita, that outlined, the nature of the challenge that we're facing, inventoried vital American interests that were at stake, like the so what, why do we care about this, drafted an overarching goal and more specific objectives, listed the assumptions on which the planning effort would be based, and then identified the obstacles to progress and the opportunities that we could exploit through the integration of all elements of national power and efforts of like-minded partners. So we held this framing session in late March because we wanted to have in place a foundation for a new China strategy before President Trump met Xi Jinping in Mar-a-Lago during the first week of April. And I brought with me the Obama administration's strategy of cooperation and engagement with China. And I read a passage to the Principals Committee of the National Security Council. Of course, there's the Secretaries of State and Defense and the heads of the intelligence agencies and the Secretary of Treasury, Commerce, and so forth. And I read the passage, and I noted that we're about to help President Trump effect the most significant shift in U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War, a shift in policy from cooperation and engagement to transparent competition, in recognition that China wasn't going to play by the rules, that China wasn't going to liberalize its economy or its form of governance, and so we posed a problem statement, which we did in each of these sessions that were oriented on what we regarded as the first order challenges or problems that we're facing in the area of foreign policy and international security. And that problem statement was how to prevent China from establishing exclusionary areas of primacy across the Indo-Pacific region and creating new spheres of influence internationally that it would use, to tear down the existing order and replace it with a new order that was biased in their favor and biased against the United States. And what we felt was at stake is that, hey, if the Chinese Communist Party succeeds, our world will be less free, less prosperous, and less safe. And so, Rita, I think this is the shift in foreign policy that survived the Biden administration, and I think will be an element of continuity, a thread of continuity through U.S. foreign policy for many administrations to come.
That's super interesting. So you've talked about strengthening our institutions. We've got a bit of time left. So let's think about what should we be thinking about for the future? We've got a deeply polarized country. I was asked the other day, how do you navigate that as an individual? I said, look, there's a lot that we agree on, right? I mean, we all want our children to be safe and prosperous. We all want, at some level, we all want clean air to breathe and clean water to drink and safe streets. And I mean, there's a lot of things we can agree that are basically good for humans. We may violently disagree about how we get there, but I think if we can sort of get ourselves oriented towards what does good look like as a society, I think that could be a really good starting point. But I'd love you to talk a little bit about, we've got a second Trump administration coming up. We know there's going to be, perhaps more drama, perhaps more chaos than might be the case with other politicians. But there's also the potential to get rid of some things that perhaps have just been growing like barnacles that maybe do need to be given some attention. And I'd love your thoughts on how we restore trust in institutions, how we kind of move forward, knowing now who our next president is going to be. How do we begin to do some of that?
Well, I think, Rita, there are a lot of things that President Trump is just dead consistent on, right? I mean, a lot of people talk about his erratic nature and so forth, but some things he's really consistent on, okay? Secure the border, right? I think the value of a lot of Trump's policies only became apparent to many Americans after the Biden administration released them. I mean, like, what does it make sense? How does it make sense to not secure your border or to be as generous as the Biden administration was on parole status for so many people who clearly didn't meet the criteria? So that's what you're going to get is better border security. And I mean, one of the achievements of the Trump administration that went kind of largely unnoticed was the Remain in Mexico policy that he got the Mexican government to agree to. The Biden administration reversed that too, right? So that's something I think that'll be positive for sure, is an increase in border security. The second thing he's really big on is reciprocity. He's to say general, like my reciprocal is my favorite word, and I think that's reciprocity in terms of market access to. He expects the reduction of barriers to entry into various markets for U.S. goods, right? If you have tariffs on U.S. products of 40% and we have tariffs on your products of 10%, well, we're going to go up to 40%, And so again, reciprocal, right? So that's going to be a big element of the trade agenda for Donald Trump. He's clear about deregulation and unleashing American innovation, right? With permitting reform and removing barriers that would allow us, I think, to shore up critical supply chains and to invigorate our industrial base, particularly our defense industrial base. He kind of buys into peace through strength. I think he will seek to strengthen our military, which I think is immensely important as we're facing the threats that we're facing abroad. And of course, he's really big on burden sharing, right? Burden sharing among allies. So I think all of that could be a very positive agenda. And for international audiences, I would say instead of defining Donald Trump as the problem, think about how to partner with the Trump administration on these issues that ought to be in common, really, between the United States and the European Union, for example. But in other areas, he has this dissonance about him. I write about this extensively in the book, where he holds these two opposing ideas in his head at the same time. So he has this impulse toward retrenchment, but he knows that, hey, Iran is the problem in the Middle East, and unless you act like you know what the return address is, and constrain the theocratic dictatorship in Iran and put pressure on them, they will continue their proxy wars against the great Satan, the United States, Israel, their Arab neighbors, and perpetuate the violence and human suffering, that we're seeing across that region. So how does he reconcile that? How does he reconcile, peace through strength with this impulse for retrenchment broadly, and the need for forward position capable U.S. military forces as a way to prevent a war, right? Because he gets it. He knows that it's a hell of a lot cheaper to prevent a war than have to fight one. And I'll tell you, Rita, I think we are, and I don't mean to be melodramatic here, but we could be on the cusp of a world war right now. I mean, look at what's happening. We have North Korean troops fighting in Europe in the first, major land war in Europe since World War II. We have a crisis that is cascaded further into the Middle East. I mean, the Iranians are providing the Shahed drones and missiles that Ukraine is using to continue its onslaught against, that Russia's using to include its onslaught against the Ukrainian people. And I think Iran has essentially activated the ring of fire around Israel to try to destroy Israel and kill all the Jews. I mean, that's really what they want to do. And look at what they're doing against international shipping in the Bab el-Mandeb. By the way, doing it under Iranian command, the Houthi rebels, with Russian intelligence that Russia's providing them. Russia, Rita, is fighting a shadow war. They're at war with us right now. You've seen attempted assassinations against German politicians. You've seen incendiary bombs on DHL aircraft, the cutting of undersea cables, the attacks against other infrastructure, the massive cyber attacks and so forth, the horizontal escalation into the Maghreb with a series of coups. I mean, you can go on and on here. The meddling in the referendum in Moldova, the election in Bulgaria, in Slovakia, and Georgia. I mean, hey, I think Russia's at war with us now. So are we going to act like we understand the nature of that competition and restore deterrence? And then, of course, we have the looming crises in the Indo-Pacific region associated with China becoming much more aggressive. I mean, 7 acts of war, Rita, in 1 month against a U.S. treaty ally in the Philippines, violating Japanese airspace with PLA Chinese aircraft for the first time ever. The soft blockade on Taiwan recently, the ramming of a Malaysian vessel, and so, I mean, I could go on and on. I mean, I think, and look at what they're doing from a cyber perspective, with the whole Volt series of attacks, on U.S. telecoms and communications capabilities and other infrastructure. I mean, I think China is preparing for war. I really do. And so how do you prevent a war? You prevent it through strength. So for the Trump administration, I would say, hey, we should have 3 top priorities right now. Number 1, hard power. Hard power matters. We try to be nifty with, the Biden administration came out with this thing of integrated deterrence. That sounds like pixie dust to me. I mean, what deters war is hard power, and we need to strengthen our military. The second is, hey, we've learned from the massive reinvasion of Ukraine in 2022 that it's a really bad idea to give an authoritarian, hostile power, coercive power over your economy. So we have to really address the fragility of our supply chains that are reliant on single points of failure controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. And then I would say the third big priority would be energy security and unleashing the potential of American energy, natural gas exports in particular, but also accelerating kind of, the small modular reactors and EM² reactors that could help us meet like a burgeoning energy demand that's global, really. And our infrastructure can't bear it now, and so we have a lot of opportunities and urgent priorities to get after. I think those would be in the top 3 for a Trump administration, recognizing, that we have to have a strong military, but also economic security equals national security.
That's very powerful. So apparently Trump at one point called you and said, hey, I miss you.
It warms my heart, Rita. It warms my heart.
Any chance you'll be signing on to that next team?
No, I think like we're kind of used up with each other. I mean, President Trump, of course, the book is not an anti-Trump screed by any means, as you know.
So just for those who are just joining us, the book is At War with Ourselves, My Tour of Duty in the Trump White House by H.R. McMaster. And it's a really detailed and very specific read. It's incredibly illuminating.
Well, thanks, Rita. But I give President Trump credit for disrupting a lot of what needed to be disrupted in Washington. But I also criticize him at times because he's so disruptive, as we all kind of know, that he disrupts his own agenda and becomes the antagonist in his own story. And as I wrote the book, the timing of the book, I thought President Trump would be either finishing his second term right now, or he'd be off the political scene. That's why I didn't write this book actually, when I first left the White House. And so I don't think anybody really foresaw that he would be, he would actually have won another election after a gap, right after and so. What I wanted to do in the book is to just tell the story of what happened. I'm a historian. I felt like a duty to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope that the story in the book, even though at times it's critical of President Trump, will be helpful to him, And when I tell the story of how people tried to manipulate him, okay, that's not unprecedented, right? The president's the most powerful person on earth, you could argue, right? So lots of people try to manipulate the president. But in telling the story of how people would approach Trump, and I characterize some of these people as Iago figures, and I use a number of Shakespearean analogies through the book. The weird sisters of Macbeth, for example. I would hope that would inoculate the president from those who were not there for his agenda, but they're there for their own agenda. And so I wish the president well. If the outcome had been different in the election, I would have wished Vice President Harris well. I think all Americans should want our president to succeed. So if I can help in any way from the outside, I'll do it. But you kind of get used up with Donald Trump, right? Most people do, and I think we're kind of used up. So I think the criteria that I used when I was in the job was that I would do the job as long as I felt that I was effective.
Mm-hmm.
And by early 2018, the spring of 2018, I concluded that I was not going to be effective anymore. Based on the degree to which the war with ourselves, had kind of worn me down, used me up.
Mm-hmm.
And I was at peace with that, Rita. When I took the job, I just resolved at the time I was going to retire from the Army when I was finished with it. I was not going to seek another position, and the president and I write about this in the book. We had frank conversations, about my transition and when it would be and who would replace me and so forth. So, and then I stayed on right after he announced that I was getting replaced by John Bolton. The title of the first chapter in the book is "You're Fired," right? Because I thought it would be interesting for readers to wonder, okay, well, why the hell did he get fired? And so then the story, the next chapter is "You're Hired," right? So I take readers back in time after that first chapter. But we left on good terms. I think when I criticized President Trump for the assault on the Capitol of January 6th, for encouraging that, when I criticized him for reversing his South Asia strategy and kind of setting conditions for the disaster in Afghanistan, he's not one, to take that criticism well, and so I think those are all kind of factors of why we're kind of used up with each other. But hey, if I can assist, any of the members of his cabinet, anybody, I think all Americans should do our best at this stage to do our role, to contribute as best we can to building a better future for the next generations, right?
Mm-hmm. So one of the things I think that a lot of people I talk to wrestle with is a sense of individual powerlessness. That like the problem seems so massive. I mean, what am I going to do about China or Russia or Iran or whatever? Do you have any thoughts on what ordinary people can do to make a difference in these matters?
Oh, thank you for that question. Okay, so here's, we need strategic competence, right? The book is in large measure about how to develop a sound, reasoned approach to foreign policy and national security. But a theme in the book is also our confidence is important. Our confidence in who we are as Americans and our confidence in our democratic principles and institutions and processes. And I think that both political parties, to score partisan points, have been kind of attacking or eroding our confidence. And in particular, Rita, what I worry about is how popular these various postmodernist, post-colonial, critical theories have become. It's sort of a new left interpretation or a Marxist interpretation of history that everything, every problem is structural or institutional, and the course of history is determined by these impersonal forces, and the only way to exercise agency is to tear everything down. Well, I don't believe that, right? I believe that our republic's not perfect, but I believe that our republic was founded on principles that were unique at the time, excuse me, especially the radical idea that sovereignty lies with the people. And our founders knew that our republic would require constant nurturing, right? At our founding, even though our Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal, right? It took 100 years almost, and our most destructive war in our history to end the criminal institution of slavery and emancipate 6 million of our fellow Americans. And then, of course, we know that that was a great triumph, but there were disappointments after that and setbacks, right? The failure of Reconstruction, the rise of Jim Crow and the Ku Klux Klan, separate but equal, which was separate but unequal, right? But we have to recognize that the achievements of the civil rights movement, the end of de jure segregation and equality of opportunity. Well, does de facto inequality of opportunity still exist? Yes, it does. So let's get after it. Let's work on this together, And what I worry about is what I would call kind of the curriculum of self-loathing in our universities. Not that we want to replace that with some contrived happy view of our history, but I think in many ways we teach, our young people that they don't have agency, right? When we put these words institutional and structural in front of every problem. And when you rob people of agency, what are they left with? They're left with a toxic combination of anger and resignation. So what I would like to see is our leaders, and that we can't wait for the political class to do it, but to stop compromising, our principles to score partisan points. But I don't think Americans, we don't have to wait for that, right? If there's a problem in your community where you think the education is substandard, or you think there aren't enough opportunities for young people to develop skills, or to enjoy life and socialize, and I'm thinking of like the Boys and Girls Clubs of America, for example. Hey, join it, man. I mean, work on it, and go after these problems at the local level. There are so many Americans who do this. We have this great program here at the Hoover Institution called the Veterans Fellowship. And these are veterans who have served with distinction in our military, who now have ideas about how to strengthen their communities. So examples are like a boxing gym in Newark, but it's a boxing gym that also teaches entrepreneurship to young people in underserved communities. There are all sorts of other initiatives. I could go on about these ideas that these veterans bring, and then make their communities better. Look at organizations like Team Rubicon, again, a veterans organization, right? That of veterans who said, hey, we're going to organize to respond to national disasters, and so that our former servicemen and women have opportunities to continue serving. So I just think talk to young people about the rewards of service in our military, out of our military. And I think we could galvanize a movement there, because I do sense, I teach here at Stanford. I have an affiliation, a fellowship at Arizona State University, quite different institutions in terms of scale and everything. But what I detect among our young generation is desire to serve, an untapped, in many cases, desire to serve.
Mm-hmm. And it connects, I think, to, in the corporate world, this sense of purpose. People have been talking about, what do the young people want? They want to join an organization that has a sense of mission, that has a sense of purpose. And I think what you're tapping into is that. So I think the big message I'm hearing is you're not without agency. There are things you can do, even if it's as simple as showing up once a week to a community event of some kind, and persuading other people. And if enough people did that, you would actually have the basis for more of a movement. There's some interesting work that's been done on true social change. And one of the things that this sociologist found was that if 25% of your social network adopts a behavior, so let's say it's a positive behavior, you're much more likely to adopt it. So I think maybe people could be thinking about, what do I do to get 25% of people more engaged in our institutions, more engaged in supporting what we need to do? I think that would be very powerful.
Absolutely, Rita. I often, when talking about this, I often use a Clinton quotation. And of course, by Clinton, I mean George Clinton of Parliament Funkadelic. And in the America Eats Its Young album in 1972, I'm telling you, George Clinton is a stoic philosopher, right? And the track is, if you don't like the effect, don't produce the cause. And I'm going to mess up these lyrics, but it's something like, ain't you deep in your semi first class seat? You protest this and protest that and eat yourself fat. Situation is just that. It has no power over you, right? Now that sounds like Epictetus to me. So I think when in doubt, consult George Clinton and the lyrics of Parliament Funkadelic.
I love that. Well, thank you so much. This hour has just flown. I could spend all day here, but I think we need to wrap up. So how do people learn more? They can obviously read the book, At War with Ourselves, H.R. McMaster. Then what else would you recommend as resources?
Well, hey, thanks. And well, if I can plug my other books, we mentioned Dereliction of Duty, but Battlegrounds was meant to really be a primer about the most significant challenges and opportunities we face internationally. And each of the parts of the book deal with geostrategic challenges like Russia, China, Iran, the Middle East broadly, South Asia, but also some of the cross-cutting challenges that we're facing in terms of energy security and climate and technology and destructive weapons and so forth. So I mean, I hope what I meant to do with that book is to continue my own self-education, but to help Americans understand better the most significant challenges and opportunities we face internationally. And then, I'm really privileged at the Hoover Institution to work with some fantastic colleagues, and some amazing students. We produce a podcast, a video series called Battlegrounds. It's long format interviews with world leaders. And the theme is a theme that I borrowed from my good friend, Zachary Shore, who's a fantastic historian. It's strategic empathy and an effort to view the complex challenges and opportunities we're facing internationally from the perspective of others, and so it's a fun project. And then I would say to anybody, go to the Hoover Institution, maybe sign up for the Hoover Daily Report. My colleagues there do fantastic work. But I really think that, what we're trying to do at the Hoover Institution, for example, is to educate the public, the engaged public about our most significant challenges and opportunities from an economic perspective, domestic policy, and international relations and security perspective, under the theory that in a democracy, you kind of get the foreign policy, you get the domestic policy, you get the policies that the American people demand. So I think we all have a role in continuing to educate ourselves, and then demanding that our political class, improve our competence, and then also restore our confidence in who we are and in our principles, institutions, and processes. Right? There's another great program here on revitalizing American institutions, for example, RAI. So, yeah, I love being here at Stanford and Hoover, and it's a real privilege to work with my colleagues every day. So, thanks for the opportunity to plug the Hoover Institution and those three books, Rita. As you know, they're page turners. You know what I mean?
They're pretty good. Well, I enjoyed it more with ourselves. I really did. So, H.R. McMaster, thank you so much for spending some time with us. And everyone, follow that advice. Look at our institutions, and we all have an opportunity to be part of the positive change to come. Thank you.